This is Greg Troutwine with Offshore Engineer TV, and we're very pleased to be joined again by Phil Lewis, the Director of Research at Intelatus. And we're here to talk about the U.S. offshore wind industry. Until recently, you were more or less positive about the long-term prospects of the U.S. wind market. Quite simply, how do you feel now?
Well, I would, at a high level, certainly less positive. Confidence and trust have certainly been impacted. If we just go back a few months, as you said, under the previous administration, the goal was to reach 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 110 gigawatts by 2050. That's pretty big numbers in the scheme of offshore wind. So the business as usual case in that previous administration recorded a pipeline of around 58 gigawatts of capacity to be commissioned by 2035. That indicated that the US was going to be one of the biggest single markets, individual markets globally. Now, behind these targets were commitments to invest in multiple turbine, monopile, and subsea cable factories in the US, so domestic manufacturing capability as well. Now, the current forecast is that only around 15 gigawatts of capacity and around 1,100 turbines will be grid connected by 2035. That's about 43 gigawatts less than the previous forecast. And to be honest, even this is beginning to look somewhat optimistic. Now, as a result of the uncertainty, developers have deferred wind farm investment plans and several manufacturing facility investments have been cancelled. Now, the tools used to execute this are presidential memoranda and executive orders rather than acts of Congress at the moment. And I would put a caveat here. There is some specific areas where there will be mounting legal resistance to some of these instructions, which means, yes, confidence is shaken, but the white flag hasn't been completely raised by the industry just yet.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not down in Virginia Beach at IPF right now, but I'll be anxious to hear what the results of that show, which traditionally has been a very strong one, what the feeling is. Of course, we'll be at OTC next week in Houston. So, I think what has happened might be a bit of a repetitive question, as I'm sure most of this audience are well aware. But
Mm.
when you look at this industry and what has transpired over the last 5 months or so, what specifically has happened?
Yeah, so let's look at the actual framework and what's been said. And I would note there have been quite a lot of, and I would use the word advisedly, hysterical headlines about gloom and doom. And I would argue that one really, really has to read the source documentation very carefully. It's not necessarily a fun read, but it's where you get the real information. Fundamentally, the Trump administration is opposed to offshore wind. The administration has said we will not issue any new leases until this current suspension, and it's a suspension, a presidential memoranda. It's not an act of Congress, so it is a suspension at the moment. What it means is it reduces a potential future pipeline of opportunity, but the pipeline behind that was already leased is actually substantial because there are about 40 leases that have been awarded that aren't actually in that permitting and development phase yet. So there's a big inventory of capacity still there. But all of those leases are subject to an ongoing federal legal review to identify reasons to cancel the lease. So it's been very specifically told various secretaries go out and find legal reasons to cancel these leases. Further, there will be no new approvals of any construction and operation plans. Now, actually, that's the ticket you need to actually build on the continental shelf. Now, there's close to 14 gigawatts of capacity in that construction and operations permitting pipeline at the moment. So effectively, you can say that's probably going to get held for at least 4 years. What happens in the next administration and the confidence behind those projects is a different question, but you're effectively shifting them a minimum 4 years, unless something substantially changes in the direction of the current Trump administration. Now, the presidential memoranda were actually quite silent on the 15 gigawatts of offshore projects that were permitted. but there have been some very, very high profile moves against two permitted wind farms. And you mentioned IPF, and certainly at IPF, they are, well, one of them in particular is very much a talk of the time. But the two projects are Atlantic Shores in New Jersey, and New Jersey wind farms were very much part of the Trump campaign's headline anti-offshore wind stance. And also the Empire Wind project off New York, which is an Equinor project. So Atlantic Shores, where that's come from the EPA. All the permits have been issued for the project, including specific EPA air pollution permits. But EPA has said the presidential memoranda says we should look at all our permitting again just to see if there were any errors. And so we're going to suspend our permitting of Atlantic Shores, and we're going to review that. Now, you would infer that by taking that action, it's going to be cancelled, but that's still quite a big inference. And if it was cancelled, I would imagine Atlantic Shores would raise quite a substantial legal challenge. So would the state of New Jersey. And also, we have the Secretary of the Interior has called a halt to the ongoing construction activities of Equinor's Empire Wind. Now, this one's at a different state than Atlantic Shores. Equinor had started nearshore construction works for the export cable, and they'd mobilized a very expensive heavy lift vessel, the Thales semi-sub, and a rock-laying vessel, the Nordness, from Europe. Both of them are currently idle in Canada, having mobilized from Europe. Now, both Equinor and the buyer of power are assessing their legal avenues to challenge, and at best, the project will be delayed, at worst, completely cancelled. But I would certainly say if you're in the legal industry in the US at the moment, go long on offshore wind, because you're going to be in the courts for quite some time with a lot of challenges. There are also indirect impacts of the Trump administration executive orders, whether it be tariffs, investment tax credits, or additional costs for Chinese-built vessels coming into the US. And further, in a surprise move to some, in April, there's a new executive order has been issued by the Attorney General to challenge state policies, many of which set legal targets to procure renewable energy in specific offshore wind. Now, this is really aimed at the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and California. In particular, there are a few other states, but this is really where it is. And this will undoubtedly lead to some very major legal challenges, and possibly through Congress, various appeals. So I think what we have at the moment is whatever happens, even if there are legal challenges and they're successful, everything's going to have an impact of delay. So your best case is delay.
Delays, cancellations, legal actions, all negative, obviously. All as a business executive, as a business leader, particularly in this segment, I can only imagine some of the choices and some of the decisions they're making today. When you look out, is there any cause for hope?
There is some, and again, you mentioned IPF, and I would say, hearing the vibe coming out of IPF, there is some concern, gloom and doom. There is worry of trust and confidence, but there is also some positivity. Now, some projects are fully permitted and have state offtakes, and they're are participating in offtake procurements. So as long as they're not cancelled, they're going. This is but this is really in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, where the states continue to support offshore wind development, and they're even discussing further future coordinated offshore wind procurements and transmission grid updates. They're still doing that today, and they're still doing that publicly. Now, this is in the face of the Attorney General looking to challenge these state policies. So you can see a state versus federal administration change, and I would certainly not put myself as an expert of US machinations of Capitol Hill, but the states have considerable power, and this will be quite a interesting debate with the state and federal bodies going up against each other. Vineyard, Revolution Wind, Coastal Virginia are currently all under construction, and as of today, still ongoing. And there's still over 6 gigawatts of permitted projects that are secured state offtakes, and a further 6 gigawatts of projects seeking an offtake that are permitted. So we have inventory of projects to go. Companies are still investing. South Korea's LS Cable and Systems recently broke ground on a new submarine cable factory in Virginia this week. Now, they have said it's specifically identified that offshore wind. It can support Gulf of Mexico subsea sector as well, but paying the power umbilicals. But it really is geared at the offshore wind, and this is a substantial investment. But looking north of the border, you've got Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador are all planning offshore wind projects, both for domestic and also for the US Northeast export opportunities. Now, and further, given the recent election result in Canada, the federal government support for offshore wind looks as if it will continue. That could give opportunities for the US supply chain, but it could also give North American opportunities for the European supply chain that was looking to attack the US market.
If you had to summarize the US offshore wind as you see it today, what would be that walk-off quote?
Well, I think during the next 4 years, the segment will be challenging and unstable. What happens beyond 4 years is unclear, but investors will have certainly lost confidence in the market, lost faith and trust, and will seek higher assurances when committing capital in the future. What that means is they might see it as an opportunity, but there will be a risk premium, because even if you have a contract, even if you have a permit, the simple question will be, what's my insurance if it gets cancelled? And that means also developers will price that risk in with the states that are buying power. So that will impact on consumers as well, potentially. Now, it does not mean there'll be no activity, just more legal safeguards and probably higher investment hurdle rates and possibly higher cost of electricity in the short term. But I'd say the industry isn't dead, but it's certainly in the US, but it's certainly facing some very, very strong headwinds.